For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
All right, looks like we are live and I am excited. Before we get started, I want to thank everybody so far for the super stickers, super chats. Thank you so much, Jeremy Martin. I appreciate it. And thank you, Doki Doki Bible Club. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. We are going to be having a cordial discussion, a respectful discourse on independent origins, biblical kinds, as compared to, say, the universal common ancestry model. So I've got Luca here, who really needs no introduction. I think everybody in the chat knows who Luca is, and he always allows for a respectful discussion on these important topics. So, Luca, if you want to unmute yourself, thanks for being here. Why don't you give a brief introduction as to who you are for anybody who might not know who you are? And
hello there.
You're going.
So, I am a chemist. I have a degree in chemistry, actually, and I'm an atheist from some time. I was once a Catholic, but I am no more from, I think, it was 10 years ago or so. And I do love science, and I really enjoy to have this kind of discussion. So that's me.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Luca. And if everybody in the chat can give me the heads up that audio and video and all the technical stuff is good, that'll be awesome. So yeah, this is going to be the start of a lot of these fruitful, profitable discussions. I know I've got a couple more that we're just looking to schedule, for example, with Andrew in the chat, and another guy named who goes by Top Dog. And so we're going to have lots of these cordial discussions on these topics. And we've got a lot more debates and interviews scheduled as well, guys. So lots to look forward to in 2021. And boom. Okay, so audio is good. Sounds good. Okay, thank you, guys. So what we'll do then, since Luca, for the most part, will be discussing my model of diversity and origins and ancestry, I'm going to just give a brief summary, I guess, of my position and what I believe are some of the stronger lines of evidence for independent origins. And then I'll just hand it over to you to kind of take the lead and bring this discussion, wherever you'd like it to go. Okay.
Fine.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Okay, so what I'll do is going to screen share here real quick and go over a couple things. Good to see everybody in the chat. This is going to be fun. So, okay, so here we go. I get my visual here. Okay. So it looks like it is screen shared. Okay, so to start this off, what I want to do is just focus on the bigger picture for a couple minutes here, at least, before we get going. I want to point out that genetics has confirmed independent origins, but not only for humans, okay? Also for animals. Given the fact, and we're going to discuss this a lot tonight, I believe, given the fact that we know animals have clear genetic boundaries indicative of the biblical created kinds. Now, right here, guys, this is a tree, obviously, but more specifically, it is a Y chromosome phylogenetic tree. Okay, everybody here is familiar with this, as well as Luca. Dr. Robert Carter, who I've had here on the channel, what he did is he took all the Y chromosomes, okay, and he made a Y chromosome family tree. Now, this tree here is incredible. It's fascinating because what we see is exactly what we would expect if independent origins and biblical creation were true. For example, we see visually okay, look on the screen, is an explosion from a central point. This is an explosion essentially from Noah. Okay, this is indicative of rapid expansion, rapid population growth. Okay. As I said, because it's an explosion from Noah, he would be our last Y chromosomal ancestor of us all. Okay. But the most important aspect of this tree that I want everybody to notice is the lengths of the branches. Okay. This is essentially all a reflection of DNA differences, a reflection of mutations over time. You'll notice by the length of the branches that this is an incredibly easy number of mutations to get in biblical time frame. Okay, here's the problem for universal common ancestry and human evolution specifically. This reflects far too mutations if deep time evolutionary history were true. What I mean, okay, to break this down, is we're not looking at tens of thousands of mutations here. We're looking at just a few hundred mutations, as would be expected if the Bible's account of independent origins were true. What I find fascinating is this data did not have to be true, and yet it is. Okay, evolutionists are constantly, and we can discuss this, are constantly having to retrofit the data into their evolutionary story. They did not predict, for example, the low genetic diversity in humans today. They did not predict the 1Y chromosomal line, nor did they predict the mitochondrial DNA line. For example, we can even get into mitochondrial DNA phylogenetics. Now, real quick before I end this here, I want you guys to consider, okay, one last thing to consider is the fact that the length of some of these branches, okay, indicate that some people can actually pick up more mutations in the exact same amount of time. What that means is it's difficult now for us to look at the branch lengths, okay, all these different branch lengths, and conclude a definitive amount of time has passed. This is why the pattern and the overall data itself, okay, the number of mutations here is so important. Okay. And last thing I'll point out before we get going, because this is going to be important for everybody to understand in this discussion and a discussion specifically on my model. Okay. We are learning so much more every single day about the DNA language. It would not be difficult to generate all the numerous species according to our model that we see today, okay, in the world that exist, simply by us invoking design diversity, which I would like to point out before we get this discussion started, is this design diversity hypothesis makes the most sense, both theologically and scientifically, okay? Consider this slide, and then I'll end this introduction. Consider epigenetics, okay, just for a second. So we have our genes, which make physical parts of our cells, while epigenetics is what actually controls how the genes make the physical parts of our cells. Our epigenome turns out to be a massive control system that turns genes on and turns genes off, as compared to, say, changing the actual genetic code itself. Our genes, I want to point out, our genes are not all turned on at the exact same time. That would not be good. That would be a way to cause cancer and disease. Good design means we need to have some type of control panel, control system, okay, a type of control that makes sure we have the right things being turned on and the right things being turned off. What this is the last thing I'll say. This is all forward thinking, which points us back to the forward thinker, the designer himself, the God of the Bible, who I would love to introduce to Luca. And that's all I'll say here. I've got some visuals for our discussion based on the questions you ask. Luca, I appreciate you listening to that. And if you want to mute yourself, go ahead. You could take as much time as you want. If you want to kind of pick at that, go ahead.
So I have some questions, quite a few, really. First of all, we are talking about a model where the universe and the world is just 6,000 years old, right? Just to be sure, but I think
that's right. Yes, approximately 6,000 years old.
Approximately. Okay, so in your model, okay, we have the Garden of Eden, the first couple, and then all their children and so on. I always I'm curious about it. What we know about this period, what we can tell about this first period from Adam and Eve and the flood, because I'm very interested in this part of the model. Okay, we do not need to spend all the time here. I just want to know what we know about your model in this period. We have Adam and Eve. Then they create some cities, some communities. We have found them. We know anything about their culture, and so on. We have Noah, and okay, but we also have his father, Lamech. Like, how did he die? Did he die in the flood, or just from old age? I think he was past 900 years old. So maybe it was just a natural death. But I really want to know more. So what we know about this period, because it's fairly important to me.
Yeah, good questions, and I appreciate everything that you've stated and asked there, Luca. So that time period would be tropical environment-wise. You'd have a much better atmosphere. Okay, essentially, you would be living in a massive hyperbaric oxygen chamber, and we know that hyperbaric oxygen chambers are used today, okay, to improve life, to improve health, to improve longevity. That's why in the pre-flood world, there would have been much better health, which as a result would lead to longer lives. Plus, of course, as we've discussed before, and we can get into, a lot fewer mutations. Adam and Eve would have been created, as I stated earlier, with design diversity. Okay, so they would not have had mutations. I want to point out one thing before you continue. The first couple, okay, independent origins essentially just means God created specially, okay, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are therefore not related to any other form of life. That's essentially what independent origin, special creation means. So we find the best lines of evidence for Eve, for Adam, for the first couple, as you put it, and I like that. We find the best evidence in our genetics, not necessarily the fossil record, but our genetics, which is actually inherited sperm and egg. Anyways, go ahead, Luca. Go ahead.
Yes, but we okay. If we want to treat this model as scientific, okay, we need some proof. So we have some proof of some kind of human community before the flood. In what I mean is, if your model is true, we have how many years from Adam to the flood? 1,600, more or less. I know that Lamech was alive when Adam died, so more or less. Okay.
Because roughly because the flood would go back about 4,500 years ago, and that's why the Y chromosome phylogenetic tree I kind of presented in the beginning there.
Yes.
That's why what we see in terms of mutations, DNA differences, we see just about 4,500 years worth of mutation accumulation in the Y chromosome specifically. Go ahead, Luca. Go ahead.
Wait a moment. Okay, we will talk about these trees, but not now. My questions are different now. Okay, we have this time period, and it's quite a big one. If the world is only 6,000 years old, we need to find those stratas, those 1,000 and more years of strata with humans. Okay, because if your model is right, we need to find humans, flood, and then so on and so on, because the flood and then more, of course. So what we find, because today I was preparing for this discussion, and I was looking for the first human cities. Okay, because if we want to find those people that lived for your model so long ago, we need to find this kind of structure. And I was looking for structure like Göbekli Tepe or Jericho, and you know Jericho for sure. You think that they can be part of your model? They are very, very old, like Jericho, I think, that have an history of 8,000 years. There are like 4 cities, one on top of the other. And we know that more or less are 8,000 years of history. And when it was destroyed by Canaanites, and I think you identify them with Joshua, I think it was. So we know when the city was destroyed, it was in the Bible. And we know that go back more or less for 8,000 years is history. The first structure are from 10,000 years ago, for what we know. I know that you are not on the same page with me with those dates, because it's even older than the universe itself, but it's a very, very old city. So for those proof of, say, of humans, the early humans, you would accept this kind of findings, this kind of cities and proof in general of their life. Please.
Okay, I appreciate that, Luca. So several points you brought there. I tried to write them down in order,
yeah,
as fast as I could. So I'll do my best to address and answer every single question that you had. So first thing that comes to mind, though, written human history only takes us back essentially several thousands of years. Okay, that is the and that would be the most direct way to determine the age of your civilizations, especially with the Egyptians and the pharaohs ruling. What they've now discovered is it's not so linear. A lot of these pharaohs ruled in overlapping ways. Okay, so when they miscalculate and add up those dates according to Egyptian chronology, it extends it past what the actual date is. So the only way that you're going to find older dates, let's say 8,000 years, as you're saying, in terms of civilizations themselves, would then be based on indirect lines of evidence, okay, such as dating methods and other assumption-based methods like thermoluminescent dating would be one of them as well. I also think the other point you made about humans, supposedly being found in what we would call flood layers and flood sediments, that we should find humans, right? Then evidence for a flood, and then post-flood history, post-flood civilization. I believe that's based on a false assumption, and I'll tell you why. It's because God tells us he created two people, Adam and Eve, the first couple, okay? And populations, okay, fully functioning ecosystems of animals and animal types. This means what we would expect to find are a huge number of animal fossils, okay, and very few to no fossils of humans. I mean, God only created two. We know that the pre-flood world was wicked, okay? Every thought in the imagination of man was wicked. When it comes to, so therefore, by the time the flood came, it's tough to say how many humans there were, but it would be extremely, extremely small, an extremely small number as compared to the number of animals that have populated essentially the entire earth, while humans probably just populated one part of the globe at that point. So that'd be difficult to find. When it comes to cities in the pre-flood world, they're not making cities out of steel. Okay, they wouldn't have been preserved. A flood today, you know, would destroy cities, but can you imagine the preservation of, say, little huts made out of wood and straw, right? We wouldn't really expect to find it. But one point that I really want to address has to do with the ecosystems of the pre-flood world, okay? Because the land of Eden, we're told in Genesis, Luca, we're told that a river flows out of Eden, okay? And we know rivers flow downhill. So that means we can logically infer that Eden was at a higher elevation, okay? And therefore we know just by the fossil record that certain animals, let's say certain dinosaurs, they would have lived in more lowland areas, okay? So that means a lot of these different animal types that God would have created fully functioning ecosystems, they would have been separated. Their ecosystems and habitats would have been separated from man and other forms of life, not just in terms of where they live, but also in terms of the height, of the elevations. Okay, so that's why, you know, in terms of what we see in the distribution of the fossil record, I believe that it is exactly what we would expect as biblical creationists. But last thing I'll say, and I think I at least attempted to address all your points, because you brought up a few there in the genetics, right? Because a lot of people might say, well, that's a post hoc ad hoc argument or rationalization that, hey, God created two people and then he created populations of animals. You know, this is you as a biblical creationist standing just trying to retrofit the data. Well, we can test these claims that we read about in Genesis using genetics. Okay, so we would expect if God really did create just two people, well, that right off the bat would restrict genetic diversity. So we would expect, okay, when we sequence the genomes of humans, we would expect a lower genetic diversity. And that's exactly what we find. Now, if God really did create populations of animals, well, then logically we would predict and expect that the majority of animals, when we sequence their genomes, they are going to have higher levels of genetic diversity because they didn't start as two at the creation event. And that's exactly what we find, higher levels of genetic diversity in animals. Chimpanzees, you know, some chimpanzee types within the chimpanzee species have more genetic diversity, okay, within themselves than humans and Neanderthals do. And I always find it funny that evolutionists then want to put humans and Neanderthals as separate species, Neanderthals as a sister species. So my whole point, to wrap all that up, is the explanation I gave as to why we find what we do in the fossil record is corroborated by the genetic data, which has been directly predicted and predicted from the account in Genesis. So go ahead, Luca, go ahead.
Okay, so genetics is a good way to find proof, and we will talk about that. But I need to say something, because for Jericho, I watch a video about Jericho, so I know something. I'm not an expert, but the point is there are 4 cities, one on top of each other. The first one, it's the older one, and we do find huts, as you said, and they were buried by the other city. The second one, it's quite strange. Those people,
Real
they
quick, Luca,
took.
because I'm just writing down what you're saying.
Yes.
So I don't forget anything when you're done.
Yeah.
Are you saying we find huts in Jericho?
Yeah, on the bottom layer.
Okay.
Because if your model is right, we are talking about a period of over 1,000 and a half years. Okay, so 1,600, a lot of time. So my point is, you are right. A flood would destroy this kind of structure, and I agree with you. But in more than 1,000 years, we would find more strata. You ever see a Roman city? Because I did, and in just a millennia, a couple of millennia, you literally you can see the difference from this day and their time. I've seen entire structure like building and so on buried under under the soil. For example, and it's not correlated, but it's just to make you understand. You know the Duomo of Milan. You know that it's one of the most famous church in my city. Well, not my city, but it's near. So you know that the Duomo standing.
Oh, I apologize. I was on mute.
Sorry. You know the Duomo of Milan.
In Rome. In Rome.
No. Milan.
Oh, okay.
Near Milan. It's a big church. It's very famous. Under the church, you will find the church of the Roman era. So 1,000 and something years ago.
Okay.
Under the current building. Okay.
Under the current building.
Several meters below the ground.
Okay.
So if we are talking about a period of more than 1,000 years, you will find structure buried under the earth. So my guess is, if you want to prove this kind of model, you have to find those. Also, if the earth is only 6,000 years ago, does it mean that you can find the DNA of this man? So the uncorrupted DNA of Adam or his spawn, right?
Yes. Well, if you're done, then I can try and start from the beginning.
And after that, we will pass on with genetics and so on. I do not want to make you lose your time. I know that you are not an expert on these topics, and I do not want to catch you off guard. Okay.
No, and like I said, I appreciate this cordial discussion, and you have the freedom to ask any question you'd like. And I think this has been a fun way to start our discussion. So I would point out that when we discuss, okay, as biblical creationists, when we discuss pre-flood sediments and pre-flood layers, okay, we are talking about layers below the KT boundary and not above. Okay, when we find huts, let's say in Jericho, this is all within the last few thousand years of post-flood human history, which according to the evolutionary model is just a reflection of time based on the very end of a needle, the tip of a needle, when comparing the entire history of evolution, right? So even the evolutionary community would say that Jericho and the remains found there are just all within the last few thousand years of human history. So when it comes to the pre-flood world, the pre-flood sediments, let's say KT boundary and below, okay, by evolutionary standards, we don't find huts. We don't find the remains of Egyptian civilizations, the remains of, say, Jericho. Are you under the impression that Jericho
Mhm.
and the events after Exodus, let's say with Moses, the Ten Commandments,
Mhm.
are you under the impression that that would be pre-flood or post-flood?
Post-flood.
Right, right. So that means these huts, let's say in Jericho, or these events post-flood, they would not have been made during the time of the global flood. So the global flood would have essentially destroyed and decimated the remains that we see in post-flood human history, post-flood human civilizations, right? These remains that we find have not been under those conditions of a global flood of catastrophic proportions. And when it comes to the genetics, like you said, we would find, or you're curious if we do find the DNA of Adam, Eve, or
It
pre-flood
does not
humans.
need to be Adam and Eve, of course. Any human capable to survive for almost a millennia will be enough.
Right.
Even his
Right.
body. And if the timeline is, like you said, 6,000 years ago, there is a possibility to find this DNA, because DNA can last for so long. And
Right.
of
Well,
course,
I was
yes.
just going to point out that if we had the remains of pre-flood humans, then essentially, depending on the conditions that the DNA was found in, we may be able to have reliable DNA. I don't believe at this point in time we have any remains of pre-flood humans, because what we do have in terms of ancient DNA is the DNA from Homo neanderthalensis, the Denisovans, right? But even according to the
But
biblical
for your
creation
model,
model,
there are post-flood,
they are
right?
post-flood, exactly. Yes. So I could not look at the Neanderthal genome and genetic sequences that we get and conclude that, hey, these are the DNA sequences from pre-flood human beings, right? So we would need, but I think the most important thing is the fact that when we look to the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments like the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, we can find Adam and Eve, we can find Noah, we can find those distant ancestors directly in the genetics. But I'm not sure. Are there any questions I didn't really answer? I mean, when I pointed out the fact that
No.
God,
I just to wrap it up. So there is a very interesting thing about Jericho. As I said, and I was trying to explain the history of that city because it's very interesting. There are 4 cities. The first one, it's really, really old, and we do not know why they abandoned the city. But we are talking for science, conventional science, about 8,000 years ago, so a lot of time. The second one was even stranger, very weird people. They
real
take
quick, Luca,
skulls from, yes.
if I could ask you,
Yes.
because you're saying that these structures, these remains are 8,000 years old. But this would not be based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, this would not be based on direct lines of evidence such as recorded human history, written recorded human history,
I
right? This
can
would
give
be
you that.
based on a.
I can
Go
give
ahead,
you
Luca.
that.
Yeah.
It's not my point.
Okay.
Let me finish and you will understand.
Sure. Go
The
ahead.
second one, even we're there, but I will not talk about it. The third one was interesting because the city was destroyed by a flood. And the date is more or less the same that the biblical flood. Because if a flood was happened, let's say that it was in that region. So the third one was destroyed by the flood. The fourth one was destroyed by the people. So it's something quite peculiar, let's say that. And we can go to the next argument. But I just want to make my point that we have this coincidence, and just think about it. The people studying these ruins, they were trying to find proof of the Jericho of the Bible, because it was quite some time ago, in the 50s. So people were looking for the Jericho of the Bible. So they were not looking for a Neolithic structure or things like that. But we can go.
Yeah, I would just say that my position is based on the direct lines of evidence, written human history that's actually been recorded directly by humans, really only goes back a few thousand years. I don't believe that any human structures have actually been discovered, okay, that are not in what we would say are post-flood sediments, post-flood layers, because even just the nature of the flood itself, right? I typically point to the incredible scope and scale of the energy produced by the global flood, and the fact that the fountains of the great deep were broken open based on the account in Genesis. The earth itself is fractured like an eggshell, right? Which would create continental sprint, meters per second movement of the plates, and the continents themselves would be moving vertically, horizontally. But the tsunamis themselves that are driving floodwaters onto the continents, okay, we would be looking at geologic catastrophes, okay? So my point is, any pre-flood huts, any pre-flood civilization, I wouldn't expect it to be found. Now, even if they are there, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack or one piece of sand on a beach, because of the fact that God essentially created two people, populations of animals. By the time you reach the flood, okay, animals would probably be spread all over the entire planet in far greater numbers than humans. Humans would probably be gathered at one place, and their population, I would assume, would be very low due to the fact that the world was a wicked place. Every thought in the imagination of man, the Bible says, was wicked, which means there was murder, there was violence like you couldn't even imagine. So to expect to find these remains, I think, is unrealistic. Now, the immediate post-flood history, when it comes to the, let's say, the Ice Age, and we don't necessarily have to get into that, but due to the ice caps, which would take up a lot of the water, okay, when those ice caps began to melt, whatever civilizations, okay, post-flood, that might have been impacted by these rising waters in the post-flood ice age, the people would have essentially departed, right? Their cities, however big they were, which means they would have then been susceptible to drowning. And I believe we do find a lot of legends of cities that essentially have been ruined due to floods, and you find the remains of those cities right? But you don't really find the people in the cities because obviously they would have ran away. So I do believe that would explain some of these legends that we find in terms of underwater cities that experience those types of floods. But I would say those are post-flood.
Just
Go ahead, Luke. I know we don't want to spend too
no,
much time.
just a quick question.
Sure.
You are talking about an ice age. When it was that ice age and how long it lasted?
Good question. Okay. So I'll point out that we would say this would have occurred very soon after the Genesis flood. Okay. But I will say before I give you the reasons why, it's because, for one, we don't believe in many ice ages like the universal or uniformitarians would believe in. But, okay, the evolutionists, when you read papers on how they explain these number of ice ages, okay, they have a number of hypotheses because they don't necessarily have the necessary conditions for an ice age. But according to our model, the Genesis flood, conditions would have been ideal for an ice age at the end of the flood. And I'll tell you why. Okay, a couple reasons that come to mind. The oceans would have been warmer. Okay, this would have been due to the hot underground water. Okay, this would have been added to the oceans at the beginning of the flood. So the warming of the oceans would have, I think everybody would agree, if you start from the flood, you're going to have warming of the oceans. But what this would cause is much of the water, it would evaporate into the atmosphere. Okay, not to mention the volcanoes that are erupting during and after the flood. Okay, there would have been a lot of dust being thrown into the air. What this would have done as a result, this is all a ripple effect of the flood. This would have blocked much of the sun's heat. Okay, essentially then keeping the continents cool. Okay, so this massive amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, what would have happened is it would have fallen down as snow. Okay, and building up significant amounts of ice on the land. Then I want to point this out. Sea levels would have fallen as the ocean's water evaporated, and they would have been trapped as what? As I said earlier, as ice sheets on the continents. And actually, that would explain the migration patterns of animals around the world, because now we have land bridges essentially connecting every single continent. But what happens once those ice sheets begin to melt out at the end of the ice age and the sea levels rise? That would have trapped like your kangaroos in Australia, for example. It would have buried a lot of cities, which is why we get these legends of Atlantis and so on and so forth. So go ahead, Luke. I talked a lot there.
Okay, no, don't worry. I do not want to stay on this topic, even though I know a lot about it, because thermodynamics, its capacity of the water are kind of my field. So I disagree with you with this reconstruction, because with its capacity of the water, you would have I cannot find the term, greenhouse effect. So quite the opposite, not an ice age. So I do disagree, but if we stay on this topic, we will not see tomorrow.
Well, would you at least agree? Would you at least agree?
I do not want to talk to take you and
all these rabbit trails. No. I agree with that. Before we move on,
I do disagree, and I also disagree on the proton laboratory experiment, but we will not make it if we went on this road. So let's go to the flood. Okay, we have the flood, we have the kinds, and we are here to discuss those things. So I have a question about your presentation.
Sure.
Finally, after an hour, we are so.
Hey, lots of good questions though. These are good
Yes.
questions that I think need good answers to. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
You say that they agree with your model. Okay, but that's an two unrooted tree. So they do describe relation to a person. So it's kind of what they are. So you have a central point, and then they do go on the page. Okay, they function like that. So can you show me those two images and describe me why exactly those things are with your model? Okay.
Okay, so do you want me to go? Okay, so specifically right now, do you want me to? I've got some
Yes,
visuals here.
the unrotted trees, the two at the beginning of your talk.
Okay, so
Yes.
let's start with humans then, and I've got some phylogeny for
Yeah,
humans and why. Yeah, I'll go find it here. Okay, so right off the bat, before I even get to it, okay, so here it is. So this is a Y chromosome family tree.
I remember.
You got a mitochondrial DNA family tree.
I remember.
Now, an unrooted tree. So these tree building programs, right off the bat, I'll point out the fact that they give you the option of a rooted tree or an unrooted tree. Okay. The reason why we have unrooted trees here, okay, and there's an incredibly important paper. I've got it in front of me. It's quite large. It's from the Proceedings of the International Conference of Creationism, where Dr. Carter goes over this in great detail. Okay. Now, the unrooted display gives us the most natural reading of the data. Okay. But here's what I want to point out that's incredibly important. Okay. Is the data itself, the number of mutations on the tree, for example, how I was pointing out that this Y chromosome tree is essentially only a reflection of a few hundred mutations and not tens of thousands of mutations. Okay. This is not a reflection of 100,000 years as the human evolution story would purport. Okay. So it doesn't change the data. And that's why the evolutionists, they have that problem. Okay, and I haven't even seen it from, Dr. Dan, where a valid or plausible explanation has been provided for the data itself. Why so few mutations? Why is every single male Y chromosome on this planet nearly identical, which indicates low variation, genetic variation in the Y chromosome, the mitochondrial DNA, the nuclear DNA? So my point is, yes, this is an unrooted tree. This is an unrooted tree, but it allows for the most natural reading of the data, free from assumptions. Go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Yes, and I agree with you. It's good for your model, but if you do return with those graph, I have some question. Okay, I'm not an expert about genetics. I did some class about biology, but was not nearly enough to discuss these topics. So I'm ignorant, and as whole people that are ignorant, I can just ask questions. So can you tell me what's your model? So at the beginning of the graph, what we should see, how many sons and descendants you need to see, where those are in your model. And also I'm pretty curious about those mutations. Who are those peoples? They are Africans, Europeans? I do not know, so I ask you. Those are
so your longest lines, let's say in this mitochondrial tree, your longest lines would be your Africans, right? That's why the Africans appear to have more genetic diversity than
Okay.
You're non-Africans, okay? But I will point out something that you said in the fact that I want you to consider this, okay? Noah was actually the oldest father in the Bible. Okay, he had kids at a very, very old age. This means more mutations may have been passed on to his children, right? As you know, patriarchal drive. Okay, so that means we can look at these branches. Okay, and that's why let's see here. In the mitochondrial DNA, you got one of the most common haplogroups in, I believe this is Europe, HVR. Okay, you see some of the branches are longer than other branches, okay, which go back to a common ancestor. This means essentially, and I think I covered this in my opening a little bit, because we see the same thing in the Y chromosome tree, okay? We see that some of the differences in the branch lengths, okay, indicate that people can pick up more mutations in the exact same amount of time. So my whole point, okay, when we consider that, it breaks the assumption of the molecular clock. When we also consider patriarchal drive, according to our model, okay, if you're, especially with the Y chromosome, if you are having kids at an older age, you are then going to be passing on more mutations. That's why I've pointed out in the past that if Neanderthals, okay, they were different because they started off different. If they were founded by an early biblical patriarch in his old age, he would have been, you know, the Neanderthal, the founder of the Neanderthal population, would have been slammed with a massive number of mutations in that very first generation, already giving Neanderthals a different set of biodiversity, which explains the phylogenetic issue. So this breaks the assumption of the molecular clock, which breaks the assumption of the human to chimpanzee split, okay? Because more people, okay, are picking up more mutations in the exact same amount of time. You can see that with the different lengths of the branches. That's why I'm focusing on the bigger picture, right? Which is the pattern. We have the same pattern for the Y chromosome, which is explosive growth from a center point, and mitochondrial DNA. This is from the 1,000 Genomes program, mitochondrial phylogeny, explosive growth from a center point. Because what does our model say, Luca? And then I'll let you take as much time as you want. After the flood, we have Noah, his wife, okay? Their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Their 3 wives, okay? So essentially, we are looking at the repopulating of the planet from 8 people, okay? But what we see according to the Bible is rapid population growth from these 8 people. So we would expect, given a natural reading of the tree, this didn't have to be true, we would expect a reflection of that. We would expect rapid growth, rapid expansion from a center point. If you really want to go down deep, if you read Dr. Carter's papers, he shows which line is Shem, which line may be Japheth, which line may be Ham, you know, but I would recommend just reading through that paper for that one. So we're not doing this all night, but
Okay.
What are your thoughts? Go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Okay, first of all, as I said, it's normal to an unrooted tree to be like that. Whole or unrooted tree are like that, so it's not a problem. On mutation and molecular clocks, I do not know enough to disprove you. So my only question is, can you show me the 3 branches from the 3 wives of Noah's son in the second one?
Oh, okay. Here, I'll screen share again. So you want to see the 3 wives? So you want to see the mitochondrial DNA?
Yeah, in your model, there are 3 women that can branch off from that graph, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So
right.
can you show me those 3 branches, please?
Yes. I'll have to go to Dr. Jensen's tree, because Dr. Jensen is the one that is taking the mitochondrial DNA data and making predictions. This is a tree from Dr. Robert Carter, okay, where I believe the more important focus should be the pattern and the number of DNA differences. And I'm going to go to the next tree and I'm going to answer your question. But I think because I've answered a lot of your questions, I am curious. And if you don't know, that's fine. That's fine. But I
Yes,
am
yes.
curious if, how best to ask this. What would be your best explanation then for why there are so few differences? Okay, so what, I mean, we could focus on rooted trees versus unrooted trees, but the point is, it's not going to change the number of mutations. So why do we only see really a few hundred generations worth of mutations? I mean, do you believe that purifying selection acted that much to remove thousands and thousands of mutations in order to preserve such a conserved mitochondrial DNA line, Y chromosomal line? Go ahead, Luca. What are your thoughts on that?
As I said, I cannot answer because I do not know. So I do not know enough to say you are wrong or you are right. So I can just ask you if your model does account for free women's. Can you show those lineage? But if you ask me why there are so few mutations, for what I know, and it's a layman understanding of the topic, because I'm a chemist, not
Right.
uh, a geneticist. A geneticist. So I do not know. For what I can understand, it's simply not simple to find the pattern, because there are mechanisms to lower those mutations. What are those mechanisms? I do not know. I just know that nature is never so simple. And I've seen the paper of Jensen, right? And I found it quite simple. And in my experience, nothing is in nature. So I cannot say that you are wrong on that, because I literally do not know.
Right.
So maybe you are right on this topic, but I cannot prove or disprove your assertion. So I concede.
Right, and I appreciate the response. I would say that by definition, okay, and I will give credit where credit is due. I agree, but I also think it's common sense. Okay, I agree with Dr. Dan. I agree with CRISPR. When they point out, and I've always thought this, by definition, right, the observed pedigree rate, okay, has to be slower, okay, because we see empirically mutation rates are fast. But by definition, your phylogenetic rate, your overall mutation rate has to be slower than the observed rate. The reason why, okay, is because a lot of those new mutations, okay, that are getting through the germ cell lines, okay, because remember, you got somatic cell line mutations, those are not getting passed on, of course. Your reproductive cell line mutations in the mitochondrial DNA of the Y chromosome, those that get through, a lot of them get weeded out over time, okay, through selection, purifying selection. So that's why oftentimes it's important to look to the substitution rate. But my point is that even when we consider, okay, and I can just send you papers on this and we can resume this at a later date, because I know you
I
kind of,
would love to.
I just wanted to point out to the audience that even when we consider extensive amounts of purifying selection, okay, because remember, the Y chromosome mutates incredibly fast, and yet the Y chromosome between humans and chimps is less than 35% dissimilar when you consider overall architecture, gene content, for example. But yet every single human Y chromosome and all human mitochondrial DNA is incredibly similar, nearly identical, which means the only way you can have, okay, a nearly identical Y chromosome worldwide and nearly identical mitochondrial DNA worldwide, and yet the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome being so dissimilar to chimps, the only way to explain that is through the Y chromosome being young the mitochondrial DNA being young, because if the Y chromosome, let's say the Y chromosome right here, let's say it really was a couple 100,000 years old. Well, based on the fact that we know the Y chromosome mutates fast, we should then find, Luca, okay, populations of humans with divergent Y chromosomes, highly mutated Y chromosomes, because humans have separated themselves throughout history. They've become isolated, but yet, no matter where you look on the planet, all Y chromosomes are nearly identical, and they can be traced back to a one Y chromosomal ancestor in the not so distant past. In a nutshell, and then we'll move on to Jensen's tree here, is the fact that we account for purifying selection. We account for substitution rates, and still, I wonder if I got that paper here. The Eve mitochondria right here. The Eve mitochondrial consensus sequence. We literally know her DNA. We found it. Okay. And the max DNA differences that separate any person on this planet, okay, the max is only like 100 DNA differences that separate us from the Eve mitochondrial DNA consensus sequence. Average is like 20 to 30. Max is about 100 in Africans and the pygmies. But even considering the 100, we can now allow for a massive amount of purifying selection, as Dan always points out, and we still get nowhere close to the evolution date of a couple 100,000 years. I mean, that's why I always point out that the evolutionists have to invoke unrealistic amounts of purifying selection, unrealistic mutation rates. And of course, you can say whatever you want on that. This is the tree. This is Jensen's tree with the three major haplogroups, Noah's three daughters-in-law. So I know you had a couple questions on that, but I also know I brought up a few things there. So Luca, just take as much time as you need and say what you need.
First of all, I want to say that with Jensen's paper, my problem with it, and I'm not an expert, so I can speak about it. No, but I'll try anyway. His model was linear, and in my experience, linear models are never too good. In some occasion, yes, but we are talking about humans, so things are never so simple. And also, there was quite an high division standard and a very high error bar in those data. And I remember speaking with Cox, is a guy that is here sometimes, and those were my problems, a layman problems, because I'm not an expert about that. On those three upper groups, they seems quite strange to me. Those people are not related. If you know how to read the tree, you can tell that those are not sisters.
So what? Go ahead.
I'm just reading the tree, and I'm not even good at it because I'm a layman on the topic.
But so essentially, then Jensen would have three roots. Okay, so Jensen is making predictions. He's saying these three nodes, okay, are the three daughters-in-law of Noah. Therefore, if this is true, this should all be a reflection of the last 4,500 years of human history, human civilization, okay? So he has made this claim, which has led to testable predictions. And the mutation rates are not so linear in his model because he explains Neanderthal DNA and African DNA and some of these divergent groups as having faster mutation rates for a number of factors, okay? But I want to point out that L, M, and N are only separated by a few DNA differences, okay? So essentially, they can be Noah's three daughters-in-law. They can essentially have lived at exactly the same time. Now, do you know, Luca, according to our model, what is post-flood times and what is pre-flood times? And I think if you answer that question, you'll understand the model a little bit more.
What do you mean, in dates or something else?
Well, like in terms of the lines that are radiating. So you got all these lines radiating. This is all a
Those
reflection.
are all post-flood, because if you start with the three sisters, are post-flood. They did procreate after the flood, so post-flood, right?
Well, I want to point out real quick before I answer that there's a good chance that one of these may actually be related because they're only separated by like one mutation. However, the other one is separated by more mutations, which means maybe they're not related. But besides that, I want to point out that no, the pre-flood history is on this tree. Jensen has made predictions. So the lines radiating out from the three major haplogroups, that's post-flood history. That's why he's making predictions on the history of civilization. But do you know where he says on this tree is a reflection of pre-flood history, pre-flood mutations?
Well, those three wives, three women, they do came from the pre-flood world.
Right, right. So good. So that would mean that these small lines here, okay, connecting the three major haplogroups.
Yes, they connecting to someone pre-flood.
So these would be, if these are a reflection of DNA differences and mutations, this would be a reflection of pre-flood times, and the lines radiating out from the three major haplogroups would be post-flood history, okay? But I want to point out that this actually makes sense, and I'll tell you why, Luca, and then take your time. Because when we consider the entirety of post-flood humanity and the fact that they would have then descended essentially from these three roots, Noah's three daughters-in-law, okay? This means that the DNA differences, okay, separating LM and N, Noah's three daughters-in-law, this makes sense. There'd be less mutations during the pre-flood times, okay, because, I mean, you had a more pure world at that time, and generations obviously were much longer. I mean, you had people having kids into the hundreds of years old. So I think when it comes to this, though, you can also go back to the fact that the overall bigger picture is still, it brings the evolutionists to the same problem, Luca, is a reflection of only a few hundred generations. There's only a few hundred mutations here. You know, even the evolutionists would agree with that. Okay, it's still explosive growth from a center point. You know, and the evolutionists, I have personally found that they have not had a very good explanation for the pattern and for the number of mutations. I mean, right here, all humans are 99.99% identical in their genetic makeup. Luca, you know that was never predicted by the evolutionary model. That's why they had to invoke the out of Africa population bottleneck, right, to reduce genetic diversity. Even here, when it comes to substitution rates, which Dan likes to harp on, how old is humanity? Well, mitochondrial DNA was found to mutate about 20 times faster than previously thought. And the substitution rates line up with the biblical model as well. But I'll let you have the last word on that, because I know you probably want to get into
my problem is, yes, it's the principal thing. So, but do you agree with me that that tree does not, you cannot read it, and if it's wrong and those are three sisters, I can give you to you, but that graph, it's not about three sisters. It's not what hinder, okay?
I don't believe that they were all three wives. I mean, two of them may have been sisters, and one was not a sister. So,
okay,
yeah,
that's your model. Okay.
Yeah, because why would we assume that Noah's three sons and their wives, why would we assume that all their wives are sisters?
But for what I can see, there are two that are related, and one that I think a daughter of those two. for what
Right.
I can tell, but I'm not an expert, so
Right.
that graph does not work unless
Well,
literally one of the three wife was a daughter of the one of the other two, and it's quite creepy.
Well, the point is the lines are short connecting L, M, and N. Okay. The only reason why the evolutionists root it where they do is based on evolutionary assumptions. But if you get rid of those evolutionary assumptions, there's still a very small amount of DNA differences separating L, M, and N. Okay. And based on the number of DNA differences separating those haplogroups, there is a good chance that two of the wives were sisters and one of them was not a sister. And that would explain the data perfectly. But I still go back to the overall bigger picture in the fact that what we are looking at, right? And that's why I started off with Dr. Robert Carter's trees, the Y chromosome, the mitochondrial DNA, where the important point to take away from all this is the reflection of only a few hundred generations worth of mutations. But I know we don't want to beat a dead horse. So do you want to move on to the
because
biblical
I'm not an
kind,
expert,
species?
so you need someone like Dan for those things. I for sure said a lot of wrong things, and my community will beat me for sure on that.
It's been good. It's been good.
In science, it's normal, so I'm fully prepared to get all critics. So let's talk about.
Actually, real quick, Luca, if I could, my man, before we switch topics, I want to point out now. I know the super chats are flying by, guys. So thank you so much, Doki Doki super chat.
Luca is on fire tonight.
Yes, we've got a good group of people. Nephilim Free, thank you for the super chat. Nephilim Free's got an after show after this. So what have we been going? Hour and 15 minutes. Okay, we'll go a little bit longer.
Flying by. Go to bed.
So we'll start to wind it down. We'll go into okay. I'm gonna point out this and then give me your thoughts. Thank you guys. Anybody in the chat, if you have specific questions, maybe just bring them to Nephilim Free's after show and we can try and address them there, because I know Luca and I want to at least get into, because when it comes to the independent origins model, Luca, and I'm curious as to your thoughts, okay? So I've got some numbers here on species. I've got the phylogeny of humans, okay, coming back to living humans. But here's what I wanted to ask you is, I asked you this question, must have been a week or two ago in our open mic. The new genetic boundary study using the CO1 gene in the mitochondria, highly conserved, low genetic diversity, giving us clear genetic boundaries between all animals, that all 90% of animals originated at the same time in this paper. Here's the paper. I find it funny that even in the paper they admit it, because a lot of evolutionists will say, what's your definition of kind? You can find over 30 different definitions of species, so they're always harping on us about the kinds, right? But the fact is, they can't even agree on a single definition of species. So have you had a chance to read this paper? And what are your thoughts that corroborating the human data, right, which suggests one Y chromosome ancestor, one mitochondrial DNA ancestor, low genetic diversity? We've also got animals also exhibiting genetic boundaries and levels of genetic diversity that are indicative of them all coming about at the exact same time, which according to our model would be the flood bottleneck. What are your thoughts, Luca?
Okay, if I remember correctly, I did read this paper, and it was talking about the 90% of species extant today. It's the one.
Yes,
right?
Yes, 90% of species.
So my question is, the other 10%, what are those? It's 1 on 10. It's
I can answer that.
It's not much, but it's
well, the 10%,
there.
because Luca, obviously, all the species today originated from species off of because we're not saying that this is indicative of the special creation event. We're saying that the species today have originated essentially from the arc kinds, right? So there still would have been kinds coming off of the arc, which would have then adapted and speciated into all the animals we have today. So the 90% makes sense. If it was 100%, then wouldn't that be the special creation event?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I have some question about that.
Sure.
First of all, you said that you think that the flood layer is above the KT boundary. Okay.
I would say
I'm not misrepresenting you, or you think something different?
I don't believe that the KT boundary is the flood boundary. I believe that the flood boundary is a little bit higher than that, because I believe the KT boundary itself and the iridium deposits all around the Earth are due to volcanic eruptions.
Okay.
So a little bit further above that, but close enough. Okay. I believe you can make your argument. So yeah, go ahead.
It's not so important for me. So all the animals like Tiktaalik, or even before the Cambrian animals, those were on the ark, or no one survived in the flood? And if they did not, why? Because aside for dinosaurs, they are I have a book about that, but they are the most famous one, of course. But we do find a lot of creatures even before the dinosaurs. So those creatures, they were on the ark or not?
Okay, so you're asking if creatures like Tiktaalik and the dinosaurs were on the ark?
Dinosaurs, I can give you to you. It's not really important. For my view, dinosaurs are still here. I've eaten one some days ago, so not a problem.
Was that a good? Hey, was that a good chicken sandwich or what, Luca?
Yeah, it was chicken with the lemon. So
that a boy.
It was good. So no problem with the dinosaurs. My problem is with the oldest one, because dinosaurs, I bet that you know it, are not the oldest creatures. In my model, we have much more ancient creatures. Tiktaalik was one, of course.
Right.
I'm not an expert on that. I do know that dinosaurs came from reptiles creatures.
Well, I would say this, Luca. Okay.
Yes.
In that, okay, for one, we have the DNA barcoding study that has at least suggested that all animals, 90% at least, have originated at the same time. We would place that at the flood bottleneck. Okay, this also places, based on DNA differences in that CO1 gene, that highly conserved gene in the mitochondria, this places genetic boundaries between species. Okay, so the bigger picture tells us, yes, there was this bottleneck. Okay, the evolutionists, based on evolutionary assumptions, if you read that paper, they place this bottleneck somewhere about 100 to 2,000 years ago. They invoke a selective sweep, which would have essentially reset the mitochondrial DNA diversity. But for us, we don't have to invoke that. We can just say, no, this fits nicely, especially when we consider observed mutation rates. This fits nicely with the flood bottleneck. But now we need to hone in a little bit on the details and say, okay, now we need to make predictions as to what is related and what is not. My definition of kinds would be organisms that descend, okay, from the same ancestral gene pool. In other words, if I go here, okay, so we've got a couple diagrams here. Let's say you've got your bear archetype coming off the arc, you got your cat archetype coming off the arc, you got your horse type coming off the arc, okay? Originally, God would have created these animals. He would have front-loaded them with a ton of genetic differences, DNA differences, and variation-inducing genetic elements as well, ERVs, ALUs, so on and so forth. This would have, over time, led to adaptive episodes, new species being created quickly because the DNA difference is already built in. Then he brings 2 of every kind, 7 of some, 7 pairs of some, onto the ark. Okay, so you get your cat kind comes off to the ark. With that created heterozygosity, the cat is then able to speciate into your lion, your tiger, your cheetah, your leopard, so on and so forth. Same thing with the horses. There's only a few horse species, your equid species. Cats overall, 37 species, okay? So my point is, and then I want you to take as much time as you want, when we actually consider the number of species on the planet today, and I'll even go with a hard one because you've heard me say this before, there's about 10 to 18,000 bird species. Okay, so say Noah brings a handful of them onto the ark. Well, I've got paper after paper that talks about how new species are forming before our very own eyes, way more rapidly than Darwin ever predicted or expected. Okay, so if we're seeing new species before our very own eyes, Luca, that means all of these species, okay, lizard species, there's only a few thousand. Snake species, only a few thousand. Rabbit species, 29. Bats, 1240. We've got cats, 37. We've done the numbers, and they line up perfectly with young Earth creation numbers. But here's my question, and then also take your time to comment on anything. Let's use bird species because it's probably the most difficult. We're seeing new bird species before our very own eyes. Why are there not 500,000 or more bird species today if, as you said, you had a dinosaur for dinner today, right? So let's say birds evolved, 350 million years ago from theropod-like dinosaurs. Why are there so few bird species that line up perfectly with a flood bottleneck of a handful of bird species just 4,500 years ago? We got 10 to 18,000 bird species. We can go into any number of species you want: dogs, cats, snakes, lizards, bats, rabbits. I got it all here. Why so few, essentially, if deep time evolution is true and the flood bottleneck is not? Go ahead.
Okay. For me, it's quite not an expert, but for me, the reason is that you cannot produce species forever, because every species has a place on this planet, and when you are good at something, you will stay more or less the same because you are already the best of the best. If you are good at your job, you will stay more or less the same, and if you are bad at the job, you will die and you will go extinct. So the reason for me is that, but it's just a layman perspective on that.
If we focus on the birds, okay, let's say 10 to 18,000. Okay, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has some highly technical papers where he's predicting roughly 2 to 3 new bird species a year. For 4,500 years, gives us the numbers that we would expect. And what's amazing is we're finding, I've got paper after paper. Here's one in 2017. This came out after he made the predictions, which is amazing, that on the Galapagos Island, new species, right? A new species of Darwin's finch. So here's the point. New species of bird before our very own eyes on islands that we're actually studying them. So imagine parts of the world where we're not necessarily studying or we have our eyes on all the time. So 2 to 3 a year, I think, is very logical and plausible. Good prediction. So what you're saying is stasis, right? A lot of these species, they make it into their environment, their environmental niche, and therefore they don't need to change anymore. But here's my problem is, if you look at birds going back 350 million years, let's say roughly, okay? I understand some animals, they're going to reach an environment where stasis may be a reality, but does stasis really account for only 10 to 18,000 species versus 500,000 species to 1 million species of birds? I mean, doesn't that, you know what, it comes down to this then, Luca, what you said at the beginning, which I respect. It comes then down to testable predictions. Do you know of any evolutionist who is making specific predictions on speciation rates to see if your answer of stasis or extinction events is actually scientific versus pseudoscientific, Luca?
I do not know anyone, but to be fair, I do not know anyone on this job. I do know someone working on a topic related to evolution, so something I know, but not with birds or animals. I'm honest about that. I did read some papers, of course. I did prepare, and I hope that it's evident from this discussion that I did. But I can't say anything about this topic in particular. But I have a question for
So,
you, and
Luca,
it's quite
go
an
ahead.
important one.
Luca, you take the floor for the last few minutes. Ask me whatever you want, and then I know it's getting
Okay.
really late for you. We can start winding
It's
down.
really my last question. Okay, you say that kinds are a good model and you think that's real. So my question is really simple. Can you show me a kind? And for a kind, I mean the original animal. And I want to be clear, no one can know for sure that some animal is the animal. Just look at the Tiktaalik. We do not know if it's an ancestor of other form of
But
life
do we have
or
the
not.
DNA from Tiktaalik?
No.
Right. So it
So
would make
we cannot know. And I do not ask for you to give me the right one, because I can understand that it's really hard to do so. But if there is a science behind all this, you can point to me to a species that you think it's a kind, a starter, the one on Noah's boat, or even one of the original kinds, of course. But I do realize that in your model is almost impossible to do so. So
Well, I
let's
would
stick
say
with the one on Noah's boat. Give me one species, not a clade, a species. Tell me that animal for me was on Noah's boat, and I will concede that there is something, because if you want to show that your model is true, what you need to do is find those kinds with genetics, with any proof that you can grasp.
well, I would say once again, and then I'll give you some specific kinds. I would say the bigger picture, right down here, which I've got a ton of information on the genetic boundary study, that the bigger picture does put genetic boundaries in species. Boundaries would indicate biblical kinds. Now we need to make predictions on speciation rates, which we have done. Right, I've done a number here and shown you why I believe the numbers line up with young Earth creation. Even if we account for stasis, extinction events still lines up. Now, when it comes to identifying the exact kinds, well, let me ask you a couple questions then. What about certain kinds of creatures that even the evolutionists struggle classifying or identifying common ancestors for? For example, what about the sloth? We see in the past sloths were a lot bigger. We see sloths look a lot the same now and then. What did the sloth evolve from? The sloth to me looks like a single created kind. The sloth, a platypus, turtles, bats. You know, what is the ancestry of these kinds of animals, Luca?
Okay, I think that for the platypus and other monodermata, because we know that we as scientists will say that we know in science there is no absolute, as you know, that whole monodermata comes from an ancestor. I think we have some. I read about it. I take my information from Answers in Genesis because I know that you follow Genesis, and so I thought that it was a good place to start. It was good to do so, or you say that I need to find something else?
No, I think Answers in Genesis is. Now, I will say, I think they're great. I will say there is some debate within the young Earth creationist community in the same way that there's debate within the evolutionary community. So you might find some
it's normal.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. I'm just asking to you if it's a good source for my information, because
Yes.
I did some research about it. Because I'm here to discuss kinds, so where find something about kinds? Answers in Genesis, of course. So for monodermata, for what I know, we have their ancestors. I do not know the name. I can find it if you give me a minute, I think.
Sure.
But okay.
Or, well, I mean, no, it doesn't matter, Luke. If you want
Okay.
to, yeah, go ahead.
I know that we have some ancestral species to monodermata, and for what I know, we can link them to other kind of mammals, because they are mammals, very primitive ones, because their characteristics, it's better not to say that. But monodermata is referring about something. Okay. So we do not know everything in science, of course, and some species, even a lot of them, are a mystery. And for me, it's not a problem. But if you want to do science, you have to take and find those things. Like for phthalids and canids, we have mustelids, I think they are. Maybe I'm wrong. We have their ancestor group, and you can say that it's not the one, and okay, but you cannot say that scientists are not trying to find those links. And we do not know if those animals are the one, but we can tell that it's something like that. Like Tiktaalik, it was found by scientists, it was predicted, and we found it on that particular strata with those particular characteristics. And I need something like that. And I do not pretend to have something that's right on the first.
Well, Luca,
yes.
I definitely don't like to leave things hanging. So when it comes to Tiktaalik, I purport that was a failed prediction. Okay. So for one, okay, I would say that, quote unquote, the tetrapod traits that are found, they are actually consistent. And I can send you some articles on papers on this. They are consistent with many living and extinct lobe-finned fish species today. But here's why it was a failed prediction, because after they found Tiktaalik, okay, years later, now I can't remember how many years later, because this is on the spot and I can pull up the paper later, but I know it was after. In Poland, what they discovered was, oh no, here's some tetrapod trackways that actually predate Tiktaalik, not by 1 million years, not by 2 million years, not by 10, but 20 million years. So the point is, where they predicted it is actually not where they found it. And the fact that we see that Tiktaalik is probably nothing more than just a bottom-dwelling lobe-finned fish, since we see those today that have a lot of characteristics for Tiktaalik. I don't even believe that that was a successful prediction of evolutionary theory and transitional forms. But I would also say when it comes to any fossils, it's low confidence science, because unless we have the DNA, we have the DNA of some. But if we don't have the DNA, then it's tough to conclude with any real certainty the ancestry of that animal, because if every single dog breed, drowned in a massive flood today and thousands of years later we dug them up, we would be concluding all sorts of erroneous interpretations simply based on morphology, anatomy. And if we don't have the genetics, then as we can see, there's more variation within this one single species than even between species, such as Canis lupus, Canis coyotes, so on and so forth. You've got Canis domesticus, which has more variation within itself than across. So without the DNA, I just think that it becomes a low quality science. So I'm sorry to go on that diatribe. What?
No, don't worry. I just want to say something, and
go ahead.
then I will leave the floor to you. So it was my point. It's almost impossible to tell that one is the one, and Tiktaalik was not, for what we know. I know about those prints, and they are not a problem. They made an hypothesis, and it was quite a good one. I think that the fact that they find Tiktaalik where they thought to find those kind of creature was quite a fit. And now I want you to tell me what is a kind for you. And I do not want you to give me the right one, because, as I said, it's very hard to get the one. But if it's real science, you need to do that work to put on an hypothesis. The cat kind, the original one, was that. And I think that because, and you give those reasons, and you go on and on, and I do not want anyone to solve this kind of thing overnight, because it's impossible. It's a very complex task to do. So, but if it's science, give me some kinds, and I mean a species, or at least something to tell me what was that animal, what were its characteristics, and so on. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I appreciate it. Well, let me screen share this real quick, just to give some visuals for you in the audience, okay? Just to see how this can take place. I've got, so right here. So obviously, a first good approximation as to what a kind is would have to do with reproduction, okay? Because Noah was commanded to bring 2 of every kind, 7 of some, whether we're looking at clean or unclean, based on propagation, okay? Filling the earth. And this is why I also pointed out epigenetics is so important, because epigenetics, the epigenome, requires a forward thinker, as in that God of the Bible who has foreknowledge, right? He would have foreknown this, and he would have foreknown the post-flood environmental conditions that would have been ever changing. And I always say it's ridiculous to hold to a position of static genomes or species that are static, because we require ever-changing genomes, okay, for the ever-changing environment that we live in. If we didn't have ever-changing and adaptable genomes, then species would be extinct through any shift in environment, okay? So I would say that reproduction, therefore breeding tests, should be a good idea for what belongs to the same kind and what doesn't. As I pointed out earlier, the evolutionary community has over 30 definitions of species because we're always finding things like hybrid animals, right? I mean, we've got the liger, okay, we've got a geep, we've got a zonkey, okay, we've got liger, tie liger. I mean, we can go on and on. Coy wolf. So point is, if the biological definition of species is, you know, a reproductive continuum, or species, if they can breed, animals, if they can breed, they're the same species. Well, we've got animals like lions and tigers, which can bring forth, but yet the evolutionists say they're different species. No, we would say they're the same kind, okay? So all of this to pretty much say breeding tests are a good first approximation. But what we know about speciation, isolation, shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity, migration, for example, this can oftentimes make species that are even of the same kind reproductively incompatible. But I would say a good test also would be in vitro. If they're incapable of reproduction in the wild, in vitro may be able to force that. And I find it very telling that we can't force humans and chimpanzees even in vitro. Okay, so now your question is exactly what the kind is. Now that we understand that, we can go to the basics. So whatever that cat archetype is, it sounds like you want an exact name of an animal that is the original created kind. Well, the chances are that original created kind may not have been what was brought onto the ark. Because remember, God created populations of animals. And due to
Of course,
speciation processes,
I told you that I want the one brought to the ark because the original one was okay.
So let's say hypothetically the one brought onto the ark, because we made a video, a very detailed video, Matt and I, about a year ago, answering R and Ra's phylogeny challenge for many reasons. Prolarius, okay, there's a good chance that Prolarius could have been the archetype. You can Google Prolarius, okay. And that creature would have had the built-in heterozygosity to be able to see. Here's the difference between my view and your view, Luca. As you know, you've heard me say it before. The evolutionist needs to build up that genetic diversity over time, right? Mutations add genetic diversity. Mutations are the source for all genetic diversity, according to the evolutionist. That means you got to build up that genetic diversity. And then through processes such as shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, inbreeding, migration, isolation, okay, recombination, gene conversion, shuffling up those DNA differences, that can produce new species according to your model. Okay. Our model, those DNA differences, that genetic diversity, it's already built in, okay, to the organisms at creation. So therefore, within one generation, just through segregation, recombination, gene conversion, we can get new varieties quickly, new chromosomal combinations quickly, because they're already built in at creation. We don't need that time to build up the genetic diversity like the evolutionists do. And a lot of times the evolutionists, like your Dr. Dan, will say, well, that's post hoc ad hoc. My wife and I have pre-existing heterozygosity. We have DNA differences within each other. That's why hypothetically we could have 1 million kids and every single kid would be different. So what I find telling is the number of species of cats we see today, okay, if you want to focus on felids, because you brought 41. That up. 37. How many? 41?
Yes. I checked yesterday on Wikipedia. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, so let's say 37 to 41. So let's say we bring something like the Prolarius onto the ark. Okay, as long as it has the genetic diversity necessary, those DNA differences necessary through processes of speciation to adapt into all your different cat kinds, then that makes a lot of sense. And that allows for predictions on number of speciation rates. Did you know that when it comes to living equid species, okay,
Yes.
there's only about 7, okay? But how many breeds of horses, of equids, are there?
A lot.
A lot. How many species of canids are there?
I do not know.
Well, if you look
I
at the
checked the phylits because I did study the answers in Genesis page, so I know about pyramids, the science about okay, hybrids. Okay, so I did study that, and I found something quite telling for me, at least. You know the term. It was cognitum, I think. They say that a lot. Those species are kind for cognitive reasons. So you know that term, or I'm playing?
I'm sorry, Luca. What's the term? Spell it out.
Cognitum. Cognitum. It's Latin for basically. I think so.
Okay, and what do you, no problem. Well, and what are you saying with that in terms of?
Basically, they say in their site, and it's quite funny for me at least, that they basically say, the within the speech basically, but with a Latin term, so it sounds so wise, and it does mean literally because we think so, and it's quite telling for me and quite funny if you know a little of Latin. And to be fair, they explain that concept in their website, so they are fair about it, and
Good.
they say that they prefer the we think so argument to the DNA and so on.
Well, let me say this. Well, Luca, let me say this.
And I'm not misrepresenting them. It's on their website. I swear. I swear. I read that on their website. And on pyramids, I was shocked to know that a human being can fertilize an hamster egg.
A human being can fertilize with what?
Yeah.
With what, Luca?
I read that on the website of Answers in Genesis. I'm not kidding.
What, that a human can interbreed with what? Say it again.
They cannot interbreed. You can fertilize an egg of an ancestor.
Well, I guess I'd have to look at that website.
Yeah,
but I want to.
You find it on their website, I think, where they talk about how to find biblical kinds. The page is that one.
Well, I want to at least say this before I forget.
It's
On
shocking.
the breed.
I was shocked too.
Well, whatever because I got to say I'm a little confused on that point. So whatever website or whatever article you're talking about, send it to me, and I'll give you my thought. I wanted to at least ask you real quick.
Yes.
Actually, I got to mute myself real quick. My wife's just about to leave for work. Give me 2 seconds, and we'll finish it up here. If you want to interact with the chat, just for 2 seconds.
Yes, don't worry. If someone has some question, please. Humans cannot, not humans, humans with ancestors, and they cannot interbreed Nephilim. You can fertilize an egg. Of course, the result is death.
Are you saying humans can fertilize an ape egg?
No. Much worse, an hamster.
A
the
hamster.
little mice
Oh,
that you
I
keep
wasn't
in your house.
ancestor.
I was shocked because that you can fertilize. It will not create anything, to be clear, but you can fertilize the egg.
I would say because all life has DNA, there might be, like, for example, for the in vitro test, breeding test, you know, it'd have to be successful in terms of creating offspring, and hopefully that offspring can also lead to fertile offspring as instead of being
Yes,
sterile. I know some of these hybrids are sterile too, but because we're coming up to a couple hours here, I wanted to at least point out one thing that I was trying to make with the breeds, and I'll give you your thoughts. Because what I find funny is, and you are correct on that, Luca, is that there are far more, most of the time, breeds than species. For example, we are looking at, and I have the slide there, from the archetype up to your 7 species today, because we've got horse, donkey, and zebra families. Okay. There exists 3 species of zebras, 1 wild horse species, 3 wild asses. Okay. But it's fascinating because we have over 850 breeds of horses and donkeys in the world today. All of those being artificially bred through pre-existing genetic differences. All of that variety. But I want to ask you this question. It's not to trip you up or anything. I'm just curious if you know. How long, according to the evolutionary model, did it take for the 7 species in the wild to come about?
Of horses,
Equids,
I think several thousands of years. I think tens of thousands.
Well, the last time I checked, the species took about 4 million years in the wild. But
4
yet,
million? Okay.
and if you want, you can Google it to make
fair,
sure.
it's fair. 4 million, it's fair. But we are talking about the ones with more toes, right? Or just normal horses with 1 toe.
Well, we're talking about the 7 species of equid. So the 3 species of zebra, 1 wild horse, three asses. But I want to make this point before we shut it down and then take your time.
Mm-hmm.
With the 850 breeds, I believe there's about 700, 850. I'll have to double check. I'm going to the top of my head here, but 700, 850, we can agree there's a lot. If they were artificially bred, if they were artificially created through natural selection, okay, with these pre-existing DNA differences from the species in the wild that they ultimately would have started from, how much time did it take for those to come about, do you think?
Okay, I do not know how time does need something to create a new species, because we are breeding dogs and cattle for quite some time, thousands of years, and we do not
thousands of years, yeah.
created.
Well, because even
created
you have
a
to
new
agree.
species as for now. For what I know, maybe I'm wrong. Some subspecies, for sure, just think about dogs. They are not the same as a wolf, but I think there are subspecies and not a species. But yeah, I think we can get there in some thousands of years, and we are almost there, because if you look to a Chihuahua, to a wolf, we came that far.
Right.
So
right.
yeah,
I think
we are in the order of thousands of years. But right now we have even better techniques. So we did create new species on the fly with GMOs and so on. And GMOs are basically super duper artificial selection with some things more. And to someone that was asking about the hamster, I posted the links on the chat, private chat, and it's on Answers in Genesis. I did not take that
Well, I
that
appreciate
part.
that. I appreciate that, Luca. I want to say
And
this
of
because
course,
we're
they say that does not count as hybrid. Of course, I want to be clear, but it's something that shocked me.
Hey, no problem, Luca. And I also appreciate you doing some research and preparing for this, because this has been a good discussion. I want to make one last point on the breeds thing, and then you, as my guest, I want to give you the last word to kind of sum everything up. And of course, this doesn't have to be this can be an ongoing discussion we can have, because there's so many good things to talk about. With the breeds, it only took thousands of years, right? Because if they're being artificially created through humans, well, obviously, even according to the evolutionists, humans haven't been around for millions of years. So it had to have occurred during human existence. Okay, so you've got all that variety, okay, over roughly 850 breeds of horses in human history, thousands of years. But then the evolutionists want to invoke millions of years for just 7 species in the wild. My point is, they're deriving these breeds, okay, based on pre-existing genetic differences, genetic diversity, where they can select this trait, remove this trait, get what they want, okay? And of course, some mutations as well. My point is, the created heterozygosity model is so strong because all of your archetypes and your original created kinds at creation, okay, that were created, they would have already had these pre-existing DNA differences, which means all of these varieties are easily explainable in just 6,000 years or 4,500 years in the flood, because we have these examples of breeds. And that's why we were laughing from the wolf to the Chihuahua. You've got a wolf, which has a lot more allelic variability and heterozygosity, okay? And then a Chihuahua, which has now hit a wall, it's hit a barrier. You're never going to breed a Chihuahuas to get a wolf. But essentially, you can get a couple generic dogs and breed nearly every single dog we have today just through those pre-existing DNA differences. So my point is, if those pre-existing DNA differences are there from the beginning, everything else flows perfectly. And we've made testable predictions on it, as you know, which we didn't even get into on DNA function, things like that. But this has been a good conversation. And of course, say whatever you want to that, Luca. I also appreciate you preparing for this, because it has led to what I believe is a profitable discussion. 2 hours have flown by. You've asked some great questions. Yes. I'm going to give you the floor, Luca. Final words, final thoughts. I'm going to let you shut it down, my man.
It was a pleasure to be here. There are a lot more things to discuss about these topics, and I really want to read all those papers. Some I did read them, as you know, but I need to be better prepared. And it was a very big topic to discuss, so it was impossible to know everything, and I was quite for all this discussion, I was trying to not press too much, just ask some question and don't be rude on anything, because I know that it's too much for everyone to know all these things. So I hope to be on this channel again in some future, and I hope that the chat has enjoyed this conversation. It was a pleasure. So have a good evening, I think, and see you again.
Well, I appreciate those. I appreciate those final words, Luca, and I believe it was a cordial, respectful discussion, and I like how we can ask each other questions, and not overly press each other and just kind of move on to more topics. And I hope that that was beneficial to the audience, as in we got to touch on a lot of good things. We got to do our best to answer a lot of good questions, I believe, from both sides. And everybody in the audience, all of my supporters, Luca, they love you. It's always a pleasure to have you either on the show or in the live chat. So I look forward to more of these cordial discussions in the future, Luca. I appreciate you coming on, and I hope that you felt that you were treated with respect, and this was a good discussion.
It was very pleasant, and it's important to me to be respectful, because I know that when you are rude to people, people do not listen. So it's not a good thing for me.
Hey, Luca, I agree with you 100%. Thanks for staying up so late. You get yourself some sleep, some rest. And
yeah, 5 o'clock.
Hey, Luca, you've earned yourself some a good sleep. So go sleep in.
Yeah, maybe I will lurk in the shadow of Nephilims, but not for long, because I'm dead. I cannot.
Hey,
I cannot join the stream. I will not be
it's why I've got a coffee sitting next to me, Luca, or else I would not have lasted over 2 hours of a discussion. So also, before we shut it down, thank you so much, JC and the Motto Heads, Moto, I believe, for the super sticker. Brother Mitchell, thank you for the super sticker as well. I tried to monitor the chat as much as I could, guys. So whatever I did get a chance to see, thank you so much for the support. You guys are the life and blood of this channel. So anyways, SFT is out. We'll see you at Neff's after show. God bless, and talk to you later.